The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show. All right, we are going to do something that I think will be very useful to a lot of people in the audience, and this was inspired by a post on our subreddit by a user named Ricard58. And it relates to this question that's often discussed in American politics. The right talks about it, the left talks about it, although usually in different terms, which is how do we pay for all the stuff that progressives want to just give away to people, all that free stuff that somebody has to pay for, Medicare for all, tuition-free college, paid family, maternity, paternity leave, the expansion of Social Security benefits, paying for infrastructure. How are we going to pay for all of those things? How are we going to cover the costs that those programs and initiatives represent in terms of the budget on a national scale? And I'm actually going to dig into it today. I'm going to tell you exactly what these things would cost and exactly how we could pay for them. But before I do that, I think it's really important just to remind people that a lot of people on the right who ask that question, how are you going to pay for that? They're asking the question in bad faith. We only ask how to pay for Medicare and tuition-free college. We never ask, as a country I'm talking about, how are we going to pay for that war or those missiles that we are just replacing on an infinite loop? And from a sort of practical perspective, how we pay for it is simple. Congress authorizes the spending, and then the Treasury actually spends the money. Yeah, debt exists. Modern monetary theory tells us that it's not just good or bad to deficit spend. It depends what we're spending on. And there's a lot of things we could deficit spend on that would actually be good for the economy. There's a whole bunch of other rebuttals. But I'm going to actually play it. I'm going to play the game at its face in this segment. I'm going to ignore all the externalities. For example, the fact that healthcare reduces crime and things like infrastructure reduce pollution and modernizing transit also does that. Let's ignore all of those externalities and just play the game that the right claims to want to play, which is how do we pay for it? I'm going to give you options that you can pick from today. So first, let's look at some programs and what they would cost. Some of these, it's hard to get an exact number because you have to account for direct costs, indirect costs, savings, all of that stuff. But here are some numbers we can work with today, all right? Here's my list of free stuff from liberals that we've got to figure out how to pay for. Medicare for all would cost an additional estimated $1.2 trillion a year. We already spend a lot of money on healthcare. Medicare for all would cost an additional $1.2 trillion. Tuition-free public college, $80 billion a year. Paid family, paternal, maternal leave, based on some proposals that we've seen in terms of how it would be calibrated, would cost about $32 billion a year. Social Security expansion, about $120 billion a year. So what we're talking about is $1.432 trillion, or if we think in billions, we're talking about 1,432 billions. Let's flip it now. What proposals exist to raise money to pay for things? And after, I'll let you decide which sound more or less interesting, which sound okay or which don't. How to pay for all of that free stuff liberals want to give you. Here's examples, then we'll add them up. If we reverse the Bush tax cuts, we would raise $488 billion a year. If we reverse the Trump tax cuts, we would raise $164 billion a year. If we ended the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we would raise $127 billion a year. In terms of ideas to pay specifically for Medicare for all, if we add a 7.5% employer payroll tax on companies, but we exempt the first $2 million in payroll. If you're a business with $100,000 in payroll, you're exempted. You pay nothing. The idea is to protect smaller businesses. We could raise 390. It says million, but it's actually billion. That's my mistake. And that would, on average, actually save businesses $9,000 a year. We could add a 4% taxpayer tax on income, exempting the first $29,000 a year. That would raise $350 billion a year. It would net save families, because remember, families are already paying for premiums and co-pays and all of that. If we did a carbon tax of $73 per ton on businesses, we could raise $300 billion a year. A wealth tax, similar to what Elizabeth Warren has proposed, if you tax wealth above $50 million at 2%, and wealth above $1 billion at 3%, you would raise $275 billion per year. Some other ways to raise money. If we increase top marginal tax rates, if you create a 40% rate between $250,000 and $500,000 a year, and a 45% rate from $500,000 to $2 million a year, and then I believe supposed to be 50% rate between $2 and $10 million a year, and then a 52% rate above $10 million a year. These are taxes on really high earners. You raise $180 billion. If we raise the Social Security payroll cap from currently it's around 128,000 to 250,000, you raise $120 billion per year. There are Wall Street speculation taxes, which we could put in place, 0.5% on trades, 0.1% on bonds, 0.005% on derivative trades. That would raise $55 billion per year. We could look at estate taxes. You could do a 45% tax on estates over $3.5 million, and then a 50% tax on estates over $10 million, 55% estate tax when you get to $50 million estates. And if people are passing on estates bigger than $1 billion, a 77% estate tax. That would raise $31.5 billion. We could end fossil fuel subsidies. That would raise $26 billion. There's an accounting measure called LIFO, which means last in, first out. You don't have to understand what it is, but eliminating that would raise $11.2 billion. And if we raised the long-term capital gains rate from 15% to 20%, that would raise $5 billion. Now, you don't need nearly all of this stuff. This is the really important thing. I've given you a list of a dozen or so ideas for how you can raise money. You might not like some of that stuff. So let's just pick and choose one configuration. So now let's compare what these programs would cost versus what we might save. Medicare for all, tuition-free public college, paid family, paternal, maternal leave, and the Social Security expansion. We're talking about $1.432 trillion. I'm only picking a few of those ideas I mentioned to you. What if we eliminated the Bush and Trump tax cuts, did the employer and household tax that I mentioned, exempting, of course, the first $2 million in payroll for businesses and the first $29,000 in income for families, and raised the Social Security cap to $250,000? That would raise $1.5 trillion. You can disagree with exactly how much money we would raise by ending the Bush tax cuts. Maybe you don't think it's, I believe it was $488 billion. Maybe you think it would only raise $450, for example. You can say, you know, I don't really want to raise the Social Security cap at all. Well, then replace that with some of the other ideas I presented. But the point is, we have more than enough tools, simple tools, to raise the money to cover what these programs would cost. You could even tweak some of these. Imagine that you say, well, you know what, I'm okay with the 4% tax on households above a certain level of income, but I think the first $75,000 in income should be accepted rather than the first $29,000. Well, that's fine. Do that and combine it with the top marginal tax rate idea, which I presented to you. We have countless tools, and we have to remember that there are two approaches when the right says, how are you liberals going to pay for that stuff? If they're talking in bad faith, and many of them are, you can say to them, were you asking how we were going to pay for optional wars? Are you questioning how we're going to pay for all of the military and defense spending that we do? Because if you're not, then you're not even really asking me to take your question seriously. If they genuinely want to know, how are we going to pay for this stuff? You give them the list of 12 to 14 items that I just showed you and have them pick. We have citations for every single one of the figures I've presented to you today. in the description for the YouTube clip for this story. My challenge to you is change my mind, because you can disagree with the necessity of any one of those ideas. You can tell me you don't think it's fair to, for example, do the estate tax change, or to put a 4% tax on households above a certain amount of income. But I've given you so many more options than are actually needed that anybody who is seriously going to look at this should be able to come away and say, you know what? I actually think we can raise the 1.4 trillion that we need for the 4 programs you've outlined by picking and choosing just some of the items from the list that I gave you. If I'm wrong here, if I'm missing something, then change my mind. I'm on Twitter at dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. I look forward to hearing from you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Dominic Doran. Dominic, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is a program that doesn't have money growing on trees or coming from right-wing, well-funded think tanks. Some of the people we'll be talking about later today do have that benefit. We don't. We actually depend on members like Dominic to fund the show. Also want to say thanks to Rick Leards, who has been a David Pakman Show member for almost 5 years. Dominic and Rick, thank you so much. You can join them at www.joinpakman.com. There's a coupon code available. If you want it, it'll save you 40%. That code is This Is 2020. This is 2020. Okay, I guess I should say, although maybe I don't need to, that this segment is not a politically correct segment. If you've been watching this program for a while, you know that political correctness has never been really a priority of mine. And those that are in the so-called realist movement are going to know what I mean. Sometimes you've got to call things what they are. And sometimes you have to realize that what you believe to be an accurate representation of the world simply isn't. And what I'm talking about is that there are all sorts of really smart pieces all over the place about what's happening to our country, what's happening in the United States right now under Trump's America. You have American writers and foreign writers who are trying to sort of figure out what exactly has led to this Trumpian America status quo in which we find ourselves during the year 2019. How can people be so gullible? Some writers have ascribed this to fear of losing status, real or perceived, influenced people into voting for Donald Trump in 2016. And yeah, that is part of it. Others have ascribed to racism and xenophobia the motivation to vote for someone like Donald Trump. And of course, that's a part of it, for sure. I can't deny that. We've seen people like Dilbert creator Scott Adams say that it's Donald Trump's skills at persuasion and influence. Even if he doesn't get every policy, Trump's persuasion skills influenced a lot of people to vote for him. And yeah, okay, that's part of it. You have the Hillary was a bad candidate angle. And yeah, okay, that was part of it. But that doesn't explain why Trump today maintains an approval rating in the high 30s or low 40s, depending on where and when you look. We've heard the meme of tribalism and partisanship cited as why we have so many people who support Trump despite being an obvious liar in terms of what he will do and not really even understanding the policies that he espoused. That's also part of it. But we are not going to get beyond the situation in which we find ourselves today until we admit that there are just lots of dumb people and some of them vote and they don't understand anything and they're not going to understand anything. So that a solution to the current problem is going to require, it's going to have to be a solution that doesn't include them. All right. Part of it's cultural. That's just a reality. Part of it is a class issue. Part of it is because education and thinking itself have been stigmatized and smeared as liberal nonsense. I'll give you some examples. Trump's trade bloviating. If you believe a con man who knows nothing about trade, that he's going to fix the problem and eliminate the trade deficit. And then you see the numbers that the trade deficit is up despite all of his negotiations and the tariffs and everything else. At a certain point, a person who is informed and capable of critical thinking says, you know what? He lied and he's a con man and I can't support him anymore. The tax cuts for middle America. We were told everybody's getting a tax cut. And now you have, as I told you last week, Republicans furious on Twitter about what they see as tax increases. Some of them are actually tax increases because they were duped. Others don't understand that your refund doesn't actually tell you what your total tax liability was. It's because they're just not knowledgeable, and we're not going to be able to inform them. We're going to have to find a solution that doesn't include these people. Trump building a wall with Mexico that Mexico will pay for. That was never going to happen, right? There was never going to be a wall built across the U.S.-Mexico border that Mexico was going to pay for. And it's also clear, according to engineers, as we looked at in detail 2 weeks ago, that there's not going to be a wall built, period, across the entire U.S.-Mexico border during Donald Trump's presidency, whether it goes on 2 more years or 6 more years. The best case scenario for a wall builder is that Trump will get a few billion for some tiny portion of it, period. It would take a decade or more, even if we started now, to do what Trump wants to do. And we don't even have the money for it at this point. So it's not happening. But you have Trumpists who continue believing it, either because of cognitive dissonance or, as I'm increasingly convinced, simply ignorance. Believing in the idea of tax cuts for the rich as good for the country. We saw that the tax cuts for the rich under Reagan, the tax cuts for the rich under Trump didn't work and raised the deficit. And the exact same thing is happening under Donald Trump. At a certain point, you have to say it's not just tribalism, it's also ignorance. When you have a system that makes it easier to get a gun than to drive a car, this is simply inconceivable in most developed countries. The world is aghast at this, but there's a bunch of people who are just not smart enough to realize how crazy it is. And then on top of this, you have to drop the vicious cycle of right-wing media like Fox News. People watch Fox News because they believe that no one other than Fox News is telling them the truth. And then we know that the more you watch Fox News, the less informed you are, even compared to watching no news at all. And it reinforces the idea that nobody tells you the truth other than Fox News. It's a circle of idiocy. Now, let me preempt what I know some of you are going to say about this story. I will get emails and tweets from people saying, David, this is why Trump won. Your liberal arrogance about Trumpists being dumb is why Trump won and will win again. No, sorry. Smart people aren't voting for Trump because liberals say that they're dumb on Twitter, right? That's not the issue. This is why arguing with Trumpists to try to win elections is a loser's game, and why I am insisting, it's happening every other show at this point, that I'm reminding you. If we want to win in 2020, it's going to happen despite Trumpists, not because of them, because we've convinced them to change their minds. It's just not going to happen, period. And that's why get out the vote is the most important tactic to take power back from this administration in 2020. Tell me where I'm going wrong. I would love to hear from you. Let's talk about the Green New Deal legislation that is now out, co-sponsored by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House and by Senator Ed Markey in the Senate. The idea of a Green New Deal is we want to deal with two major issues: climate change and economic inequality. New Deal refers to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the post-World War II era. Stimulus, infrastructure, job creation. And the idea of a Green New Deal is to do another New Deal, but one that takes into account everything we know about climate change and the environment. So AOC and Markey put out a 14-page resolution. The right goes bonkers, saying there's no details. This is pie in the sky. It can never be done. It's impractical. We've got no way to pay for it. It doesn't make any sense. Even Nancy Pelosi is being careful about the Green New Deal, saying it's an enthusiastic idea and that's good, but she's also kind of laughing it off by calling it the Green Dream. So right away, the main thing is this a step-by-step list of policies with a guide as to how to implement them and how to pay for them? The answer is no. Is it just a list of things which would be nice with no other relevance? No. Is this 14-page proposal meant to become the law? Not really, but that doesn't mean that it can't be impactful. So what I'm going to tell you first is what the Green New Deal wants to do, and then I'll tell you where I think Democrats may be going wrong with this, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad proposal, okay? This Green New Deal is a list of goals. And some of them are vague. Some of them are unrealistic in terms of their timing. But it's a really important list of what should be priorities for any serious progressive candidates at this point. Everybody should read it before commenting. It's only 14 pages. And the way they do these resolutions, the margins are gigantic. Like, you would never be allowed to turn this in as a school paper. It's only like half the width of the page because it's so narrow. So there's very little text on the page. The first 2 pages just kind of frame the situation. So it's very little actual text. Every single one of you should look at it. The proposal gives a 10-year time horizon to do the following. Number 1, get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions with 100% of power demand through clean, renewable, zero-emission energy sources. Okay, yeah, it's not realistic. Doing it in 10 years while at the same time upgrading all existing buildings in the United States to the most modern standard, it's extraordinarily unlikely you'd be able to do that in 10 years. But this is actually exactly what the goal should be. Creating millions of jobs is a goal. Okay, that's great. We should say more about how. Investing in infrastructure, but sustainably. Fine. Securing clean air, water, climate resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment. Fantastic. It's short on the details, but we'll get to that. Promoting justice and equity by stopping and preventing oppressions of all kinds. I like it, but you've got to be more specific about exactly what you're talking about, and hopefully at some point we will see that. There's a lot of even more vague ideas, like, for example, quote, building a more sustainable food system that ensures universal access to healthy food. That sounds good, but we've got to talk about the specifics of what we mean by that. Investing in high-speed rail and public transit. Absolutely, but we're going to have to flesh out how. There are some more specific items like cleaning up hazardous waste and abandoned sites that are toxic at this point. We should do it, of course. The most important thing about this document, though, for me, is the timing, because it's a totally fair criticism that this doesn't lay out exactly how you do these things, although that's not uncommon in these initial proposals. It's a fair criticism that it doesn't outline how to pay for it. That's also common. It's very common that when you get a proposal in the House or Senate, the proposal says what you want to do. You separately outline how it would be paid for in an appropriations bill. It's a fair critique, but that's commonly how these things work. The most important thing about this document is that with the Democratic primary ramping up, no 2020 Democrat has straight up backed away from it. You do have some Democrats playing a little coy with it. Like Elizabeth Warren said, she's into it, but when she was asked, what specifically do you support in it, she didn't say. Cory Booker, I forget exactly what he said about it, but it was, again, this kind of more timid support of it. But if at this point you're running in 2020 as a Democrat and you say, I am against the bill, that's a real problem, and that's a good thing. And that's one of the most important things that this bill, that this proposal actually does. Now, we do need to figure out a path to doing it, and that's a really important thing. And what we're already running into is that you have a number of people on the left making strategic mistakes. Like, for example, I saw an advisor to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the Tucker Carlson show. I apologize that I forget his name. I believe he's a Cornell University law professor. And a lot of the defenses that he issued were arguing that Tucker had merely misunderstood the proposal and what AOC tweeted and said about it. And some of the denials were really not particularly believable. I think that that's a mistake. I think the idea that would much better serve the left would be to be completely on the same page that, listen, it doesn't say how we pay for it. That's normal. Separately, we're going to put out a proposal for how to pay for it. That's what Bernie did with Medicare for All and then with how to pay for it. When they say a lot of these things are too ambitious, you respond and you say, these are the goals. Let's see how much of it we can actually get done. It's a really bad idea, in my estimation, to sort of back away and play semantic games as I've seen some people do. That's why the right ends up winning. They say we're going to prioritize ending abortion as we know it and tax cuts for everyone. And then they pass some restrictions on abortion, and then they cut taxes for the rich and corporations, but then they can claim victory and they are putting points up on the board and they end up getting themselves reelected. The left should not fall into the game of saying, okay, fine, maybe we're not going to do it in 10 years. Maybe we would shoot for 50% net zero, 50% of the way towards net zero in 15 years or something like that. That's a mistake. That is a mistake. We should actually be taking a page from the right here in terms of how to handle the criticisms of this proposal. I want to hear from you. I'm on Instagram at david.pacman. The show is on Instagram at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Will MacAskill, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University, one of the progenitors of the social movement of effective altruism, which encourages the use of evidence and reason to do as much good as possible. Will, it's so great to have you on today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So let's see. Let's maybe start with, why would we even need a movement that wants to focus altruism effectively? In other words, what is often ineffective about altruism and the social movements that are inspired by it that would sort of cause us to say, hey, we should really think about how to be most effective in our altruism?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are really trying to do good and are really well-intentioned there. But unfortunately, the world's so complex that good intentions often aren't good enough. And there are many projects that people undertake that not just, like often they're just squandering kind of most of their resources, or even can actually end up doing harm as well. And so that's why it's crucial when we're thinking about all the different problems we could be facing, all the different things we could be doing, folk trying to think not just what does a little bit of good, but what does the most good possible.
Yeah, one example I've discussed with my audience when it comes to the world of sort of international aid is that there will many times be this phenomena where you will have a Western company that produces some kind of product who will decide that they're going to give a whole bunch of those products to an impoverished population in the developing world. Shoes would be an example, or whatever the case may be. And that has obviously a positive short-term effect. People need shoes. People are better able to go to work if they have shoes. But it doesn't really do anything to address the fact that for the long-term sustainability of that population, you're really going to need to have sort of like a local shoe industry. And in fact, you may be hurting that in the long term by giving everybody free shoes. Is that the type of concern that you're dealing with? Is it just one among many? Or tell us about some of the other kind of maybe misplaced forms of altruism.
Yeah, I mean, giving of shoes is a great example. In fact, we often think of just the charity Give Directly as a kind of base standard by which to compare other altruistic activities, where Give Directly simply transfers cash to the poorest people in the world, saying, well, you know best about how to spend money to help yourselves. We've got to have a really high bar for thinking, we know better than you about what's most important in your lives. But yeah, unfortunately, international development and do-gooding more generally just has the history of many often quite amusingly failed projects to try and help. So one example I like to use is the Play Pump, which is this children's merry-go-round that would double as a water pump. So children would play in this merry-go-round, and using the force of their play, they would pump clean water up to a tank that would provide the needs for the village. And this got tons of awards at the time. It won the World Bank Development Award. It was lauded in the press. But it was a terrible idea. I mean, aside from health and safety, so kids would sometimes fall off and break limbs, sometimes vomit from the spinning. it was also just not a very good pump. So unlike a normal merry-go-round that spins freely once you pushed it, this would require constant torque to pump up the water. And so kids would get very tired. They wouldn't want to play on this thing all day. And so it would be left up to the mothers or grandmothers of the village to push this brightly colored play pump round and round, a task they'd often find humiliating. And what's more, the kind of real kicker is just that this pumped far less water than the very boring but very functional Zimbabwe hand pump that these pumps sometimes replaced. And yet it pumped less water for 3 times the cost. And so despite, seeming like this amazing, exciting invention, it just wasn't really what people actually needed. It wasn't the best way of helping people. And stories like this are just all too common.
In Doing Good Better, you sort of lay out some of the underlying principles of effective altruism. And if we were to sort of start to develop, not necessarily a guide, but maybe at least sort of like a framework for thinking about how we can have the greatest impact, how important is the concept of deal with the worst first? In other words, the idea of finding the most dire problem that we can solve and trying to make improvements there. Is that an important concept, or is that one that maybe can be a distraction from figuring out the best way to do good?
Great. I think it's an important concept, but crucially, it's only one part of the truth. So we like to focus on problems that are very important, that is like very great in scale. That's the kind of direness you're talking about. But then also that are particularly tractable, and also that are particularly neglected. So a problem might be really great in scale, but just very hard to fix. So the fact that we all die, aging, huge problem, kills 100 million people a year, but maybe not the most important thing to focus on right now, just because, well, such a hard problem to solve scientifically. And then neglectedness is perhaps the most unintuitive of these criteria, where it could be the case that a problem is very great in scale, and there's actually plenty of stuff you can do about it, but just there's already a lot of attention being devoted to it. And I give the example of kind of disaster relief in this category. Obviously, providing funding after the disaster is, it's hugely important, and there often are like many very good things you can do about it, though perhaps harder than some other areas. But disaster relief funding, it just gets a lot of funding compared to what I would call ongoing natural disasters like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS. And that means that on the margin, with the additional funding that you use, it's not as effective as something which might be in the news less and therefore get less attention.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the news at the very tail end there. A lot of this does seem to be media-driven in the sense that the ongoing crisis of all the kids, to use a stereotypical example, all the kids dying of hunger in Africa, compared to an acute weather event, for example, in the United States that kills a dozen people or 24 people, and the sort of imbalance of media coverage relative to the harm that is done. That seems to significantly influence how people choose to either spend their time volunteering or make donations, does it not?
Yeah, this is absolutely huge. And that means why, people will want to focus on something like disaster relief rather than, say, deworming, which is one of our champion causes, where, it just doesn't make the news, at least not until recently, that about 1 billion people worldwide have intestinal worms in their guts. And this is probably the least sexy cause area you could imagine. And it doesn't kill as many people as other diseases, so it gets less attention. But it's phenomenally cheap to treat. You can cure children of intestinal worms for less than 50 cents per person. And that there's at least some evidence for thinking that that has long-lasting economic and educational impacts for those children, which is huge.
It seems that a lot of this is related to this idea that one person who dies is a tragedy which we all can sort of connect with in the specific sense, but a statistic of 10,000 people dying doesn't necessarily resonate with people in a sort of coherent narrative sense. And in that way, you could reduce, imagine, for example, that the number of kids dying from hunger in Africa is 10,000 a day, a week, whatever number it is.
Yeah, yeah.
If you reduce that to 8,000, you've just saved 2,000 people, but it's still not an incredible news story, right? Because now the news story is only 8,000 died. Whether if we find housing for the victims of a hurricane and we see their faces and we know their names, that's incredibly powerful in a sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, humans are just evolved to identify and empathize with individuals, whereas when numbers get so large, it overwhelms us. So we do often see these, campaigns that can raise hundreds of thousands of dollars because one person, maybe one child, has some debilitating condition that needs a large amount of money. And obviously, it's great that people, reach out for their wallets to try and fund that. But at the same time, that amount of money could save the lives of 100 children elsewhere whose plight is less salient to us. And what effective altruism is about is trying to just, step back, accept that emotional impulse, that empathy is what's going to drive us, but then trying to use our ability to think and to reason to then guide that to wherever our efforts will have the biggest impact in terms of improving people's lives.
For people who are doing the majority of their altruism by donating to charities and nonprofits, what is the infrastructure you propose for evaluating where to donate? And in that sense, I'll throw out a few things. Obviously, the subject matter of the nonprofit is important to many people, and many times people are making contributions to nonprofits that are working on something that they're personally connected to. But from the point of view of, for example, looking at the percentage of donated funds that get to the beneficiaries as opposed to being tied up in administrative costs, is that type of analysis the type that the average person should be doing to figure out where to donate, or do you propose a different infrastructure?
Yeah, so the metric of how much is spent on overheads versus programs, I just don't think is very helpful at all.
Interesting.
Because you could have a really dumb program, one, like the Play Pump, for example, and maybe it had very, very low overheads, had only 1% overheads. But if you've got 1% overheads on what's not a very good program, you're still just not going to be a very good charity. In contrast, perhaps you spend 30% doing research, monitoring and evaluation, identifying the very best places to help. And then you're funding something like deworming, where you're having this huge impact, perhaps 100 times more, 1,000 times more, even than typical ways of doing good. Well, if you're getting 100x on some other charity, taking 30% off of that, even though I would say that 30% is necessary in the first place, well, that doesn't, you're still doing this far more good than if you've been focusing on a kind of lesser program. And so for individuals, what I'd recommend actually is, in general, just trying to follow advice and recommendations of kind of experts that we've tried to build up this infrastructure. So just in the same way as if you were investing your money, you wouldn't, best advice is not to do it yourself. Instead, maybe go with an index fund or go with good financial advice. We have a bunch of experts who, in total have spent tens of thousands of hours trying to work out what charities do the most good. And within the area of global health and development that we've talked about the most, GiveWell is the charity that really produces outstanding research on this topic. And if you go with their recommendations, you can save a life for just a few $1,000s. If you're interested in other cause areas, at effectivealtruism.org, we have a set of funds that focus on either global health and development or animal welfare or on the long-run future. So rather than trying to help people today, trying to ensure that human civilization goes as well as possible for the centuries to come. And there, you can donate to this fund that then experts will redistribute to the places that they think are going to have the biggest impact.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. We're going to link to a lot of those organizations in the description for the YouTube video for the interview. We've been speaking with Will MacAskill, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University. Will, so great to talk to you. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
When Donald Trump selected Matthew Whitaker to be his acting attorney general after Jeff Sessions was forced out, we knew that there were endless problems with this. We knew about Whitaker's previous comments about how if he were in a position to influence the Robert Mueller Trump-Russia investigation, he has very specific ideas for how he would starve it of funds in order to prevent it from happening effectively. We've talked about how Matthew Whitaker is on the record previously as publicly saying he believes that the entire Trump-Russia investigation by Robert Mueller is an overreach from a legal perspective. And so where we kind of came to where we ended up in terms of our conclusions was that Matthew Whitaker had no business whatsoever being acting attorney general for even an hour, never mind a few months. But ultimately, he remained in that position and continues to be in it today until Attorney General Barr is presumably confirmed at some point relatively soon. So that gets us to Friday. On Friday, Whitaker testified before the House Judiciary Committee, and it was such a gong show of embarrassment for all that is good and logical in the world. And I'm going to play some clips for you here. We're going to start with Congressman Jerry Nadler, who asked a really simple question, which was, have you ever been asked to approve any request or action to be taken by the special counsel? And his answer was, Congressman, your time is up. And you will actually hear the room audibly gasp and groan at this answer from Matthew Whitaker. Take a look at this.
In your capacity as acting attorney general, have you ever been asked to approve any request or action to be taken by the special counsel?
Mr. Chairman, I see that your 5 minutes is up, and so I'm here voluntarily. We have agreed to 5-minute rounds, and
the committee.
I think that's a fine place to end the 5-minute rule.
You can't use the fact that your testimony is voluntary as a reason not to answer. And if anything, that's a reason to subpoena this guy right away and get answers to these questions. And then in comes Congressman David Cicilline from Rhode Island. And he starts getting into it with Whitaker, and it goes just as poorly. Take a look.
You were briefed by the special counsel. You've acknowledged that. Did you share that information with any members of your staff, the information you learned in that briefing from the special counsel or his team?
Congressman, as I previously testified, there was one other individual in that briefing with me.
And who is that individual?
It is the U.S. Attorney from the Eastern District of California who I've brought on.
What is the name of the individual, Mr. Whitaker?
His name is Greg Scott.
So did you communicate any information you learned in those briefings to other members of your staff?
I don't believe so, no.
So that you understand, those slow answers, those pauses from Whitaker are because at the beginning of his 5 minutes, Congressman Cicilline said, I have limited time. I don't need you to thank me for my questions. I don't need you to say the questions are good. Just answer the questions. And then Whitaker adopted this strategy of just pausing for a few seconds before each answer, and it kept going, and it was just as bad.
Do you know whether any information that you learned in those briefings were communicated to anyone at the White House?
As I mentioned previously, Congressman, we have kept a very close...
Mr. Whitaker, it's a yes or a no. Do you know whether it was communicated to anybody at the White House?
As I sit here today, I don't know whether it was communicated.
Did you put into place any restrictions or limitations or instructions to your staff not to share this information with anyone at the White House or the president's legal team?
Yes, together with the general standard that investigative information and materials are need to know and law enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker.
You've got to hand it to him. I mean, he's doing a great job of eating up as much of those 5 minutes as possible without really saying anything. Let's continue to the third clip.
Did the president lash out at you after Michael Cohen's guilty plea for lying to Congress about a Trump Organization project to build a tower in Moscow?
The president specifically tweeted that he had not lashed out.
I'm asking you, Mr. Whitaker, did the president lash out at you? I'm not asking you what he tweeted. I don't have a lot of confidence in the veracity of his tweets. I'm asking you under oath.
Congressman, that is based on an unsubstantiated...
Sir, answer the question, yes or no. Did the president lash out to you about Mr. Cohen's guilty plea?
No, he did not.
And did anyone from the White House or anyone on the president's behalf lash out at you?
No.
So then we get into a really good logic pretzel. On January 22nd, Congressman Nadler sent Whitaker a letter with questions that Democrats might ask him during exactly these hearings that we're watching about his conversations with Donald Trump. And in the letter, Nadler tells Whitaker, consult with the White House ahead of time about whether Donald Trump would invoke executive privilege over those questions, allowing Whitaker not to answer without simply refusing to answer. This is really key. Cicilline asks Whitaker whether he showed the questions to the White House, and Whitaker says that he didn't. So thus, if Whitaker hasn't shown the questions to the White House, there'd be no way to assert privilege, and it gets really confusing. And then Whitaker just won't answer whether or not he's actually spoken to Donald Trump about the Mueller or any other investigation into him, which, of course, he shouldn't be doing.
Did you share the questions that Mr. Nadler forwarded to you prior to this hearing with anyone at the White House or the president's legal counsel?
Congressman, I did not.
So when you claimed earlier that you were going to invoke a privilege, you were invoking a privilege about questions the president hasn't even seen.
Congressman, to be clear, I'm not invoking any privilege.
Well, you said earlier that you, in your written testimony, that you would not answer questions about your conversations with the president. Did you not?
Yes, I did.
So you are not sitting here today saying the president has instructed you not to answer a question, correct?
I am not sitting here today saying that the president has instructed.
So then you're prepared to answer all these questions.
Congressman, I think I was pretty explicit in my opening statement.
So have you spoken to the president, Mr. Whitaker, about the Mueller investigation?
Congressman, as I have previously testified, I did not talk to the president about the Mueller investigation.
Have you ever spoken to the president or parts of his legal team about information that you've learned in your capacity as acting attorney general related to the Mueller investigation or any other criminal investigation involving the president?
Congressman, while I have specifically been saying that I'm not going to comment about my conversations with the president or his senior staff, I have also been very clear that the president has not instructed me to do anything.
So that wasn't my question. My question is, have you had conversations about what you learned? That's a yes or a no.
Congressman, I spend all day, every day talking.
Mr. Whitaker, my question is very specific. Have you spoken to the president or his legal team about what you've learned in the Mueller investigation or the related criminal investigations that may involve the president? Yes or no?
Congressman, as I specifically answered earlier to a question.
Mr. Whitaker, you're clearly not going to answer the question, so I'm going to move on.
Yeah, so we don't get any further with that. And then the cherry on top, Pat, is that after the hearing, Whitaker was spotted at Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. When you watch this, does this guy strike you as honest and forthcoming and transparent?
Well, I'm glad he's just the acting attorney general. And I think compared to this guy, William Barr is going to do a lot better. It's not easy to obstruct justice. I mean, the president has struggled with that continually over the past couple of years. And Whitaker didn't do too well either.
No, certainly not. And we will see ultimately what the day is where future Attorney General Barr takes over. I wasn't sure whether to talk about this next story. We've spoken about Candace Owens before. She's this very well-funded conservative woman, a Trump supporter. She is anti-Black Lives Matter despite being black herself. She works for Turning Point USA, which gets money from everybody ranging from the NRA and the Heritage Foundation to just individual rich conservatives. And she's become a really useful tool of the pro-Trump right. And they had this completely failed movement called Blexit, which was supposed to be the black exit from the Democratic Party, totally failed. She, as far as I was told, turned down debating Kyle Kulinski and I at Politicon in October alongside Charlie Kirk. Although I believe on Twitter she has claimed she doesn't know who I am, so maybe Politicon didn't really speak to her about that debate. I don't really know what the truth is, but what we know for sure is that she's really ignorant. We talked about the climate change fiasco on the Joe Rogan program. We've talked about her basic economic ignorance. And this is really important in the end because the right has this system set up of really funding the entire apparatus of young conservatives, and the left doesn't. So people like Candace Owens end up becoming prominent where similarly ignorant people on the left don't, because there's no funding apparatus that is artificially propping them up. So that's kind of the setup. Video surfaces over the weekend of a speaking gig that she did in London. And in the video, she defends Hitler. There's really no other way to say it. Some people are saying she praises Hitler. Let's be a little more charitable if it's not praise. She's certainly defending Hitler. She was asked about nationalism in Western politics, and she brings up Adolf Hitler and how his real wrong step was becoming a globalist. Take a look.
Yeah, I agree. I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism. I think that it gets, the definition gets poisoned by elitists that actually want globalism. Globalism is what I don't want. So when you think about, whenever we say nationalism, the first thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler. You know, he was a National Socialist, but if Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The problem is that he had dreams outside of Germany. He wanted to globalize. He wanted everybody to be German, everybody to be speaking German, everybody to look a different way. That's not, to me, that's not nationalism. In thinking about how it could go bad down the line, I don't really have an issue with nationalism. I really don't. I think that it's okay. It's important to retain your country's identity and to make sure that what's happening here, which I think is incredibly worrisome in terms of the decrease in the birth rate that we're seeing in the UK, is what you kind of want to avoid. So I don't have anything I have no problems with nationalism. It's globalism that I try to avoid.
If Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, then that's fine. But the problem was that he wanted everyone speaking German. Well, the problem also was that he wanted to kill Jews and killed 6 million Jews and gay people and all sorts of others. How do you comment on Hitler? And your critique is that he went a little too far beyond nationalism to globalism. And this, in a sense, Pat, this should be career ending, but it's just not going to be. It's not going to be because they've couched it in a way as to make it appear to be less crazy than it is. It's not going to be career ending because she's extraordinarily well funded. But who in their right mind wants to hear from Candace Owens? Like, who even goes to watch her speak?
Yeah, this is, I think, her second major gaffe, the first being her appearance on Joe Rogan, where you could tell that she had absolutely no idea what she was talking about on the issue of climate change. And she was just, taking this grab bag of conservative ideas and talking about stuff that she really had no business talking about. This is kind of like the second instance of that. She wasn't prepared to take a question on nationalism and globalism, and she went off the rails, I think.
It's important to understand that this is what happens when you artificially prop up ignorant commentators. Candace Owens didn't float to the top of young right-wing activism because in the free market of ideas, she was the best. She is propped up artificially. She's the equivalent of a sort of beneficiary of a pundit subsidy. Turning Point USA and its funders decided, we are going to fund Candace Owens. And then this is what you get. Someone that, as I've said before, it's not even really clear that she's actually a conservative. It seems that she was mostly non-political, realized that the young black conservative female character is a really profitable one because of its usefulness to the right. And you end up with someone like this who has decided, hey, this is a great character for me to play. Who is surprised? Who is surprised that this is what it ended up with? We've got a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. It is from a DACA recipient. Take a listen.
Hey, David. I just want to get your advice that I'm a 17-year-old DACA recipient, and I was just wondering, what can I do when I'm 18? Should I go back to my country and get my green card there, or should I stay here and wait till anything happens to the DACA program? I just want to know your advice because I'm really stuck in this situation. So thank you.
Yeah. Listen, you need a lawyer, and there are lawyers available who will help you even if you can't afford a lawyer. But my understanding is that DACA status extends to people up to 31 years of age. So I don't know offhand of why anything in particular needs to happen when you turn 18. Look into that. There are lawyers available. Google it, and you need someone to help you out with that. Best of luck. We have a great bonus show for you today. We'll hear about Pat's vacation. We will hear about my very weird weekend and much more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.